The bailiff asked everyone to stand, and my knee chose that exact moment to remind me it was 76 and vindictive. I stood anyway. Pride is a terrible personal trainer, but I've been loyal to it for decades. The man suing me was tying his shoelace, not nervously, carefully, as if this were a normal morning and courtrooms were places people stopped by between errands. That small, almost intimate gesture unsettled me more than any accusation could have. Angry men are predictable. Calm men with nothing left to lose are a different species entirely. I've bought silence from people louder than him. I've bought anger, loyalty, forgiveness, and once briefly love. Silence is usually the cheapest of the lot. You'd be amazed how affordable dignity becomes when someone's rent is late. He didn't look at me while he finished tying the lace. I did look at him. Of course I did. I always look at my problems straight in the face. It's how I decide whether to write a check or a will. The judge entered. Everyone sat. My knee cursed me again quietly, but with feeling. I should explain something before this goes any further. I am not a villain in the theatrical sense. I don't monologue. I don't enjoy cruelty. I recycle. I tip well. I've funded hospitals that smell like lemon cleaner and hope. I've shaken hands with men who changed the world and women who pretended not to notice. I also destroy lives with exceptional efficiency, usually by accident, usually while meaning well. My lawyer leaned toward me and whispered, "We can still end this today." He said it with the confidence of a man who believes the universe is a vending machine that accepts large bills. I nodded slightly. Not yes, not no, just habit. My body has learned that nod long before my conscience caught up. Across the aisle, the man, let's call him that for now, because reducing him to a legal title felt cowardly, finally sat upright. He was thinner than I remembered. Or maybe I had just grown wider with comfort. Time does that. It sculpts some people and inflates others. The judge cleared his throat and said, "My name." Not the version embossed on buildings. The shorter one. The one used by doctors and disappointed relatives. It sounded unfamiliar in his mouth. Vulnerable. I didn't like it. "This is a civil matter," the judge began, the way judges always do, as if saying it enough times makes emotions file the proper paperwork. Civil. A polite word for bloodless violence. As opening statements droned on, my mind did what it does best when threatened. It wandered backward, searching for precedent. Not legal precedent. Personal. I was looking for the moment where all this became inevitable. It wasn't the first time I met him. That would be too neat. Life rarely gives you clean origin stories. It was the second time. The first time, I barely noticed him. He was just another man in a room where I had influence. He stood near a wall, hands marked with paint, listening more than speaking. I remember thinking he looked misplaced, like someone who had wandered into the wrong future. The second time, he was laughing. She had just said something sharp and kind at the same time, and his laugh arrived a fraction of a second before the room reacted. That was the thing about him. He was always early with emotions. I was always late. Her laugh followed his. Lower, warmer, familiar in a way that made my chest tighten with irritation and interest. If you're waiting for me to say I fell in love instantly, you'll be disappointed. I don't fall. I calculate. I observe patterns. I wait for leverage. Love for me was never lightning. It was erosion. Back in the courtroom, my lawyer stood and spoke about misunderstandings, about opportunities offered and declined, about how generosity can be misinterpreted when pride gets involved. He was elegant, persuasive, entirely wrong in the way that still convinces people who need to believe the world is fair. Then the other lawyer stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture much. He spoke like a man explaining a process he'd lived through so many times it no longer surprised him. He talked about power. Not money power, the kind that dresses itself as help and insists you be grateful while it rearranges your life. He talked about choices presented as inevitabilities, about doors that look open until you realize someone else is holding the frame. I felt a familiar itch in my fingers, the urge to fix, to interrupt, to negotiate. I had spent my life mistaking motion for morality. The man finally spoke when asked. He stood without drama, no trembling. No performance. He described his work, his plans, the way things were supposed to unfold before they didn't. He spoke about the offer I'd made him once, not angrily, almost academically, as if analyzing a weather event that had flattened his house. It wasn't the money, he said. It was the way it was framed. Like resistance would be irresponsible. The judge watched him closely. I watched her. She sat behind them, hands folded, expression neutral in the way only practiced honesty allows. Time had refined her. Less softness, more precision. She hadn't looked at me yet. That hurt more than the lawsuit. I remembered the night I'd made my move. A dinner that began as concern and ended as a transaction. I had told myself I was simplifying things, removing friction, helping everyone avoid unnecessary pain. I was very good at telling myself useful stories. The judge called for a brief recess. People stood, papers shuffled, reality stretched its legs. My lawyer leaned in again. "He'll take the money," he said. "Everyone does. We just haven't found the right number yet." Across the room, the man was drinking water from a paper cup, talking quietly to his lawyer. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't tense. He looked finished. That's when I understood something I should have learned decades earlier. You can buy silence from people who want to move on. You cannot buy silence from someone who wants the truth heard. And sitting there in a courtroom that smelled faintly of old wood and consequence, I realized this wasn't a trial about money at all. It was a trial about which one of us would finally stop lying first. By the time the doors closed behind us for the recess, I already knew I wouldn't like what came next. Courtrooms don't reveal truth. They extract it slowly, the way dentists work without anesthesia when they suspect you can afford the pain. I followed my lawyer into a narrow hallway that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet. He was talking. I wasn't listening. My mind was busy replaying a dinner from 15 years ago, polishing it, trying to sand down the edges that were starting to cut. "You need to understand the angle here," my lawyer said, finally forcing my attention back to the present. "This isn't about damages. It's about narrative. And right now, his is cleaner than yours. My narrative built a city," I replied, "and now it's on trial," he said, without irony. I smiled despite myself. Good lawyers know when not to flat a dot in the restroom mirror. I adjusted my tie and studied my face like a stranger's. The eyes were sharper than they used to be. Not wiser, sharper. Wisdom softens. This was something else, habit sharpened by years of winning. I remembered when winning felt innocent. The dinner had been my idea. I framed it as concern, the way I framed most invasions of other people's lives. Private room, excellent wine, soft lighting designed to suggest sincerity. He arrived late, apologetic. She arrived tense, already suspicious. She had always been better at sensing danger. We talked about practical things first. Rent, stability, the future. I let them speak, nodded, asked the right questions. People open up when they think you're listening instead of measuring. Then I made the offer. I didn't slide a check across the table. That would have been vulgar. I talked about opportunities, about a position that would suit his skills somewhere far away, about how love survives distance better than resentment survives proximity. I spoke calmly, kindly. I didn't tell him to leave. I just made staying feel irresponsible. Back in the hallway, she stood near the window, staring down at the street like it owed her an explanation. She hadn't noticed me yet, or she had, and was pretending not to. That was her specialty. "You always did love corners," she said, without turning around. "Places where people feel boxed in. I prefer solutions," I replied. She turned then, slow and deliberate. "You prefer outcomes that don't inconvenience you. That's not fair." "No," she said. "It's accurate." We stood there, the silence between us heavy but not hostile. Time had done something strange to us. It hadn't healed. It had clarified. "He won't take the money," she said. "I know. You don't know why," she replied. "You think it's pride." "It's not." "Then what is it?" "It's closure," she said. "The kind you can't outsource." She started to walk away, then paused. "Did you ever ask yourself what you wanted that night?" Not strategically. Honestly, the question landed harder than any accusation. She left before I could answer, which was merciful. I didn't have one. When we returned to the courtroom, the air felt thicker, like the room itself was leaning in. The judge called the next witness, him, again. This time, the questions went deeper. Not into facts, but into motives. Why he'd agreed to leave. Why he'd trusted me. Why he hadn't fought harder. He didn't flinch, because I believed him, he said simply. Because when someone speaks with certainty and resources, you assume they've thought of consequences you haven't. I felt something shift inside me then. Not guilt, recognition. That had always been my advantage. I didn't need to threaten. I just needed to sound inevitable. He talked about the years that followed, jobs that never quite fit, relationships that frayed under the weight of unfinished business, the slow realization that the choice he'd made wasn't really his. The jurors listened like people hearing their own near misses explained out loud. My lawyer objected once. The judge overruled him without looking up. Then something unexpected happened. They called me, not to testify. Not yet, just to answer a procedural question. A formality. I stood, walked to the microphone, and felt every eye in the room adjust to me. This was my natural habitat. Attention had always steadied me. The question was simple. Dates, confirmations, signatures. I answered accurately, efficiently, and then, without warning, the judge asked, at any point, "Did you consider how this would affect him long term?" The room froze. My lawyer stiffened. This wasn't on the script. I could have said yes. I could have said no. Both would have been lies in different ways. I considered outcomes, I said finally. I didn't consider cost. The judge nodded slowly. That answer would haunt me later. The session ended soon after. People filed out, voices low, expressions thoughtful. No one looked at me with her anymore. They looked at me like a cautionary tale. Outside, cameras waited. Microphones extended like accusations. I ignored them and got into my car. As we pulled away, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You still think this ends with a check?" It doesn't. I stared at the screen until it went dark. For the first time in a long while, I felt something unfamiliar and deeply inconvenient. Anticipation. Anticipation is an odd emotion when you're used to control. It's like standing on a familiar balcony and discovering someone has quietly removed the railing. You don't fall immediately. You just become very aware of gravity. I spent that night not at home, but in my office. The penthouse felt too ceremonial, too confident. My office, at least, had witnessed doubt. I poured myself a drink I didn't want and sat behind a desk that had negotiated peace treaties and divorces with equal indifference. At T2 in the morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened old files, not financial ones, personal. The kind assistants don't organize because they don't know they exist. Emails never sent. Notes scribbled during flights. A photograph of the three of us at a charity fundraiser, all smiles. All eyes still intact. She was between us in that photo. I remembered thinking that night how easily life arranges people into shapes they don't understand yet. Triangles are the most dangerous. They look stable. They're not. The next morning, court resumed with the quiet brutality of routine. No drama, no raised voices, just the steady stripping away of narrative until only structure remains. They called her, this time not as background, as testimony. She walked to the stand without hesitation. No nerves, no performance. The oath felt unnecessary. She had always treated truth like a habit, not a promise. Her lawyer asked simple questions. Who she was, how she knew both of us, how long. Then the questions sharpened. She talked about the offer. My offer, not as an event, but as a process. How it began with concern, softened with reassurance, and ended with inevitability. How she'd felt herself becoming an obstacle in a conversation she hadn't been invited to join. She looked at the jury when she said, "He never told me what to think. He just made every alternative feel reckless." I swallowed. The defense cross-examined her gently. Too gently. That was a mistake. They asked if she'd benefited from my support, if doors had opened, if her life had improved materially after the change. Yes, she said. That's what made it corrosive. A murmur rippled through the room. She described love the way an engineer describes stress fractures. Invisible at first, inevitable if ignored. She spoke about the night she realized she had stayed. Not because she believed me, but because leaving would have required admitting I was wrong. I watched the jurors' faces. No judgment, just recognition. Everyone has stayed somewhere too long for the wrong reasons. Then came the question I hadn't prepared for. Did you believe he intended harm? She paused, just long enough to make the room lean forward. No, she said. That's what scared me most. The judge thanked her. She stepped down. Still didn't look at me. My lawyer leaned in. We need to recalibrate. Too late, I said. During lunch, I didn't eat. I watched him instead. He sat alone, scrolling through something on his phone, expression neutral. I wondered what his life looked like now. Who he went home to. Whether the future felt larger or smaller than the past. I remembered a conversation from years ago. He had said, casually, I just want something that's mine. At the time, I'd smiled and told him ambition was healthy. I had missed the point entirely when court resumed. They introduced documents I hadn't seen before. Letters, drafts, messages. Not illegal. Not damning in isolation. Together, they formed a map, a pattern of influence, a signature, my signature. The judge listened carefully, asked precise questions, the kind that sound neutral but aren't. Then something shifted. They called a witness I didn't recognize, a former employee, one I had let go quietly, generously, years ago. I barely remembered his face. He remembered mine. He spoke about instructions given indirectly, about how suggestions became expectations, about how no one ever said no because no one ever had to. He wasn't angry. He was relieved. That was worse.by the end of the day, the room felt altered, not hostile. Just awake.rs we packed up. My lawyer touched my arm. You need to prepare yourself. This isn't trending in our favor. I know, I said. Do you want to testify? The question hung there, heavy. I looked across the room. She was speaking quietly with a clerk. He was gathering his papers, methodical and hurried. I will, I said. But not yet. That night, I walked the city again. No driver, no coat. Just me and streets that didn't care who I used to be. I passed a restaurant we'd gone to once. The table by the window was occupied by a young couple arguing softly. I smiled. Some things are universal.at home. I found another message on my phone. This one from her. You're finally being seen. Try not to disappear now. I set the phone down and sat in the dark for the first time. I understood the real risk of this trial.it wasn't losing money.it was losing the story I'd been telling myself for decades and realizing I might have to live without it. I agreed to testify the way some men agree to surgery, reluctantly, late, and with the quiet hope that maybe the pain had been exaggerated by people who hadn't survived it properly. The night before, I dreamed of balance sheets bleeding ink. Numbers slid off the pages and pulled on the floor, forming words I pretended not to recognize. When I woke up, my chest felt tight, not with fear, but with preparation. Fear is noisy. Preparation is silent and cruel. The courtroom was full the next morning. More full than before. Curiosity spreads faster than truth, but it often arrives at the same destination. I noticed new faces, students, reporters who didn't smile, a woman in the back row who looked at me like she was solving a puzzle she already disliked. When my name was called, I stood without ceremony. The walk to the stand felt longer than it was. Every step seemed to drag an old decision behind it, scraping loudly enough that I was sure everyone could hear. I sat, raised my hand, swore to tell the truth, and wondered briefly when that had stopped being my default setting. The first questions were predictable. Background, career, philanthropy, a carefully constructed runway designed to make the fall look accidental. I answered calmly. Honestly, even. It's easier to tell the truth about success. No one doubts it. Then the questions shifted. They asked about influence, about intent, about the difference between offering help and steering outcomes. I answered the way I always had, with precision, with context, with language that softened edges without denying their existence. I could feel the jury listening, but not leaning in. That worried me. Then the other lawyer stood. He didn't rush. He didn't smile. He let silence do what money often can't. Do you believe, he asked, that power carries responsibility? Yes, I said. That part was easy. And do you believe, he continued, that responsibility ends when intentions are good? The question landed cleanly. No theatrics. Just logic. No, I said. Then why, he asked, did you never check back? I blinked. He clarified gently. You offered a solution. You benefited from the outcome. Why didn't you follow up to see how it played out for him? The room went very still. I could have said I assumed things worked out. I could have said people don't want reminders. I could have said I was busy saving the world in other ways. Instead, something in me finally broke rank, because following up would have complicated the story. I said. My lawyer stiffened. The jurors looked up. What story? The lawyer asked. The one where I did the right thing, I replied. The one where everyone was better off because I intervened. He nodded slowly. And if that story had been wrong? Then I would have had to change, I said. Silence again. Different this time. Not judgment. Wait, they asked about her. That surprised me. I had expected they'd circle around her carefully, respectfully. Instead, they went straight through. Did you love her? Yes. Did you consider how your actions would affect her relationship? I hesitated. That was new. I hadn't hesitated yet. I considered outcomes, I said. I didn't consider autonomy. The words tasted strange, necessary, and when she objected, I reframed, I said. I was very good at that. There it was. The confession without drama. The truth without apology. I glanced at her. Then, she was watching me. Really? Watching. Not angry. Not hopeful. Curious. As if seeing whether I would flinch from my own reflection. I didn't. When I stepped down, my legs felt weak, but my mind felt clearer than it had in years. That frightened me more than guilt ever had. Guilt is manageable. Clarity demands action. The rest of the day unfolded without me at the center, which was a new sensation. Experts testified. Analysts spoke about patterns of influence, about ecosystems of power where no single action is illegal. But the cumulative effect is devastating. I listened like a student who had accidentally enrolled in the course he'd been avoiding his entire life. During a break, I found myself standing next to him at the water fountain. No lawyers, no witnesses, just two men and terrible plumbing. You didn't have to say all that, he said, not unkindly. I know. Why did you? I considered lying. Habit is a stubborn thing. Because I'm tired of winning arguments I don't believe anymore, I said. He nodded once. Not agreement, recognition. That evening, the judge announced they would move toward closing arguments the following day. The room buzzed with anticipation. Finality always excites people who aren't living with the consequences. Outside, the cameras returned. Louder, hungrier. I stopped this time. I'm not here to defend my image, I said. I'm here because I confused influence with wisdom and people paid for it. That's all I have to say. They shouted questions. I walked away. Later, alone, I realized something unsettling. I wasn't afraid of losing the case anymore. I was afraid of winning it. Because if I did, I would have proof that the world still worked the way I'd always exploited, and I wasn't sure I could live comfortably inside that knowledge ever again. The morning after closing arguments arrived like a reluctant guest, bringing with it the kind of silence that feels heavier than words. I sat alone in my office, staring out at the skyline I had once thought belonged to me. Every window reflected a city that had grown without asking permission. That, at least, hadn't changed. My phone buzzed with a message I hadn't expected. It was from her. He's waiting. If you want the truth, go. No explanation. No apology. Just a direction, as sharp and precise as a scalpel. I sat with the phone, feeling a flicker of that old thrill I used to mistake for Control.by mid-afternoon. I was walking through streets I barely recognized. Industrial blocks gave way to old brick warehouses with peeling paint and graffiti that had survived decades like stubborn weeds. I found the address she had hinted at a workshop. No sign. Just a heavy door, worn by use and indifference. Inside, the smell of sawdust and oil greeted me. The place felt alive, humming with human effort. He was there, standing over a bench cluttered with unfinished woodwork. He looked smaller than I remembered, but no less determined. You're late, he said without looking up. I was deciding if I should come. I said, you always come. Eventually, I studied him. The years had not softened him. If anything, they had honed him into a sharper version of the man I had underestimated so many times. He didn't invite me in. I didn't ask. We stood in a quiet standoff, two men measuring time and weight without a scale. He handed me a piece of rough wood. Splintered edges. Marks of labor. This is what I made the first day after you left me to my own devices, he said. I ruined it at least twice before I saw it properly. Every mistake teaches something eventually. I ran my fingers over it, pricking my skin on the splinters. Pain. Simple. Honest. Immediate. You always believed consequences could be managed, he said. That they would obey your schedule. Some of us learned differently. We drank bitter coffee, made from beans too cheap to mask the day's fatigue. He told me about the years following our conflict, how he rebuilt himself without asking for help. How small victories mattered more than any grand gesture I could have funded. She never hated you, he said quietly. That's the trouble with love. It doesn't always follow logic, even when everything else does. I nodded. Hatred would have been easier. Anger is manageable. Love is messy, invasive, stubborn. I didn't come here for forgiveness, I said. Good, he replied. I don't have any to give. We sat in silence for a long time. Not hostile. Not peaceful. Just existing. It was exhausting in the way honesty always is. When I finally stood to leave, he didn't stop me. You know, he said, the trial didn't fix anything. I know, I said, but it made space, he said. Space is something you can work with. That night, I walked home slowly, letting the city hum beneath me. Phones, messages, notifications, I ignored them all. She called me after I arrived, her voice calm, measured. I heard you went to see him, she said. Yes, I admitted. And it was enlightening. Truth travels slower than lies, she said, but it always gets there. We spoke longer than we should have. About regret, about consequences, about age, about the rare freedom of finally facing what you've done. I don't know what we are now, I said. We're honest, she replied. That's new. I hung up and sat in the dark, staring at the city lights. For the first time in decades, I wasn't calculating, negotiating, or bribing. I was simply paying attention, and I realized in that quiet, inconvenient moment that the real trial hadn't ended in the courtroom. It had just begun. The courtroom felt different the next morning. Not hostile, not threatening, just aware, like the air itself had absorbed the weight of the confessions, the admissions, the truths spoken and those carefully withheld. I sat in my assigned seat, the polished wood warm beneath my hands. My lawyer whispered last-minute notes, legal jargon I barely absorbed. I nodded mechanically, letting the motions of preparation shield me from reality. He entered quietly, not the man from the workshop, the other one, the man who had refused the money, the man who had refused every convenience I'd ever offered. His presence was calm, almost detached, but I recognized it immediately. That kind of calm is deliberate. The kind that knows the outcome is irrelevant compared to the process of making someone see themselves. The judge called the session to order. Opening statements had been delivered, witnesses called, arguments exchanged. Now, it was time for the heart of it, the testimony that would reveal not facts but intentions, not evidence but character. I was first. I walked to the stand slowly, deliberately. Each step echoed in the high-ceilinged room. Every eye seemed to measure me, not just my actions, but the distance I'd traveled to stand here. It was exhausting. My chest felt tight, not from fear, but from the anticipation of unmasking a lifetime of carefully curated fads. The oath, recited automatically, felt redundant. I had always been truthful, if selectively so. My honesty had been convenient, often self-serving. Today, it would be tested in ways money could never influence. The questions began with simplicity. My career, my accomplishments, my contributions to various causes. Straightforward, factual, the kind of inquiry that allowed me to shine without risk. I answered with precision. No embellishments, no excuses. The jury absorbed it, nodding occasionally, taking in the story of a man whose success seemed inarguable. Then came the questions about him, about the man who refused the money, about the choices made, the consequences felt, the opportunities offered and declined. My lawyer had prepared me for legal framing, for the strategic deflection of culpability, but strategy felt suddenly absurd. I realized that my usual defenses, logic, persuasion, charm were meaningless here. Did you ever consider how your actions would affect him? The attorney asked. I hesitated. Not because I didn't know, but because I had spent a lifetime avoiding this reflection. Yes, I said finally, but not fully. Not in the way that matters. The courtroom went silent. Even the air seemed to lean in. I could hear the soft shuffling of papers, the slight creak of the judge's chair, the faint hum of the ventilation. It was the kind of quiet that forces people to confront their own participation in the narrative unfolding before them. You assumed, the lawyer continued, that your interventions were beneficial, that your influence was inherently positive. Is that correct? Yes, I admitted. And I was wrong. A pause. A space pregnant with realization. The jurors scribbled notes. Some faces hardened. Others softened. Recognition, I think, is a more dangerous witness than anger. It doesn't judge. It illuminates. Then came the question that landed hardest. Did you ever stop to ask her? He gestured toward her in the back row, the one who had once been central to our triangle, whether she wanted what you were giving. I swallowed. My throat felt dry, my pulse deliberate. I remembered the dinners, the offers, the careful framing of assistance as opportunity. I remembered the nights I had convinced myself that guidance was synonymous with protection. No, I said finally. I did not. And I see now that was my greatest error. She looked at me then, directly, not with anger, not with expectation, just observation. Like a scientist noting a result she had long predicted but hoped to avoid witnessing. The questioning moved to the man who had refused my money. He spoke with deliberate calm, detailing his experiences not as accusations but as exposition. How my offers, my interventions, my careful manipulation of circumstances had shaped his life without his consent. He did not speak angrily, nor did he speak with malice. He spoke with clarity, precision, and the quiet confidence of someone who had survived. It was never about the money, he said. It was about being seen, truly seen, in a way that didn't presume my acquiescence. I felt a familiar, unwelcome sting, the kind that arises when power meets its limits. I had assumed that influence could substitute for understanding, that control could be mistaken for benevolence. I had been wrong. When asked about my intentions, I did not deny them. I did not justify them. I spoke plainly, as I had never spoken before. I acted with what I believed were good intentions. I failed to consider the autonomy of those affected. I failed to see that assistance is not inherently kind if it is demanded silently. The jury leaned forward. The room seemed to shrink. Silence, heavy and precise, filled every corner. The man's calm was a mirror reflecting my miscalculations. In the break, my lawyer approached me, the worry in his eyes barely concealed. "That was honest," he said. "You understand what that means?" I nodded. "Yes, it means there is no turning back. Not legally, not morally." He hesitated, then said quietly, "This could affect the verdict more than any argument about money." I understood perfectly. The verdict would not be determined by my ability to pay. It would be determined by whether the jury believed I understood the consequences of my actions and whether I deserved to have the opportunity to make them right. After the session resumed, witnesses testified about patterns, about influence, about the subtle coercion of power wielded with intention disguised as benevolence. The man who had refused my money remained calm, precise, unwavering. His presence was a constant reminder that control is an illusion when the stakes involve autonomy and truth. I listened, absorbing the details, not defensively, not strategically, simply absorbing. It was exhausting in a way that exhilarated me. Exhaustion is the honest sibling of understanding. By the end of the day, the courtroom was quiet again. The jurors left to deliberate. Reporters lingered, cameras waiting. The man approached me in the hallway. No lawyers, no witnesses, just the two of us and the weight of everything left unsaid. "You didn't have to say all that," he said quietly. "I know," I replied. "Why?" "Because I'm tired of winning arguments I don't believe in," I said. He nodded once. Recognition, respect, not forgiveness, not pity, just acknowledgement. That night, the city felt unfamiliar. The lights seemed sharper, the shadows longer, the air heavier. I knew that tomorrow, when the verdict came, nothing would be simple. Not money, not justice, not love. Everything was tangled in ways I had never anticipated. I returned home and found a message waiting. Not from lawyers, not from journalists, from her. "If you think this ends with a number, you're mistaken. Truth has a different cost." I stared at it. Let the city hum. Let the night deepen. I understood finally that the trial was far from over, not because of law, but because of human hearts. And hearts, unlike contracts, cannot be negotiated, purchased, or predicted. The real test was about to begin, not in court, but in the space between love and consequence, where honesty weighs heavier than gold. The morning of the verdict arrived like a silent storm. The city outside my window moved as usual, indifferent to the tension pressing down on me. I dressed slowly, deliberately, as if choosing each piece of clothing could armor me against the weight of consequence. My suit was expensive, well-cut, familiar. Its fabric held decades of power, but it could not shield me from truth. I arrived at the courthouse early. Not to intimidate, not to negotiate, not to charm, simply to be present. The man who had refused my money was already there, leaning against a wall, arms crossed, calm in a way that made everyone else fidget. His presence was a quiet anchor, reminding me that courage does not need display. It simply exists. The courtroom filled quickly. Cameras, reporters, jurors, spectators, all drawn to the spectacle of wealth measured against principle, of influence confronting integrity. She arrived last, slipping in silently, not looking at me directly. She didn't have to. I could feel her presence like a constant current. The judge called the session to order. No preamble. No unnecessary formalities. This was it. The foreperson of the jury stood, and the verdict was read. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with anticipation of the inevitable reflection that follows. Truth, guilty, not guilty, liability established, damages assigned. Each phrase rolled past me like a distant echo until the words landed. Partial liability. The financial penalties were significant, but not crippling. What mattered more was the message. My influence had consequences that could not be ignored or bought away. The courtroom exhaled collectively. Reporters scribbled. Cameras clicked. The man who had refused my money remained still, his eyes calm, unshaken. He had won something that could not be quantified, recognition. She rose and walked past me. Our eyes met briefly, just long enough to communicate the complicated truth that had hung between us for years, understanding without absolution. No words were needed. None would suffice. After the session, I followed him outside. No lawyers, no journalists, just the two of us in the crisp afternoon air. You still think this is over? He asked. I thought I did, I admitted. But I see now it never was about money. He nodded, silently acknowledging the distance between us, both literal and moral. Then he turned and walked away, leaving me to consider the meaning of restraint, of principles held without compromise, of the rare integrity that refuses to bend. I stood there longer than necessary, watching him disappear down the street. For the first time, I felt something unfamiliar, humility. Not the performative kind, but the kind that quietly reshapes the way you view every choice, every action, every intention. Later that evening, I sat alone in my penthouse, the city lights sprawling below like a tapestry of ambition and regret. I opened my laptop and began typing. Not a statement for the press, not a justification for the record, just words, raw and unfiltered, chronicling years of decisions, misjudgments, and lessons painfully learned. I wrote about the nights I had convinced myself that influence was benevolent, about the countless ways I had mistaken compliance for consent. I wrote about her, about him, about the moments where love had been tangled with control, where kindness had been distorted into obligation. I wrote until the words themselves exhausted me, leaving a residue of clarity that I had long avoided. When I finally stopped, I realized that the trial had not ended. The courtroom had delivered its judgment, but the real work was ongoing, repairing the fractures of trust, reconciling with the truths long ignored, and accepting that love and power are not interchangeable. She called me later. Her voice was calm, measured, filled with the quiet authority of someone who has witnessed consequence and survived. You've been seen, she said. Now it's time to see yourself. I understood. Seeing oneself is not about reflection in a mirror or calculation in spreadsheets. It is about facing the choices that shape not only your life, but the lives of others, and acknowledging the cost without excuse. I nodded, even though she could not see me. I will, I said, and I meant it. For the first time in decades, I meant it. The man who had refused my money, the woman who had once held our triangle in delicate balance, the courtroom, the verdict, they were not endpoints. They were catalysts pushing me toward a reckoning long overdue. I realized that the greatest risk I had ever taken was not financial, not social, not even romantic. It was the risk of honesty, the risk of admitting without caveat that influence is not virtue, that love is not leverage. And that truth, however uncomfortable, is the only currency that cannot be bought, borrowed, or ignored. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, staring at the cityscape, contemplating the quiet consequences of a lifetime of decisions. And for the first time, I understood what it truly meant to be vulnerable, to be accountable, to face the human cost of power. Tomorrow, the world would move on. Reports would be filed. Gossip would flourish. People would misinterpret, misquote, and misremember. But I would know. And that knowledge, fragile and profound, was mine alone, for the first time. I felt ready not to undo the past, not to erase mistakes, not to reclaim lost love, but to live with the truth I had finally learned to see. The trial had ended, but the story was only beginning. The morning was grey, low clouds pressing against the city like a warning. I didn't bother looking at the skyline. I had seen it enough, measured it enough, claimed it enough. Today, the view was irrelevant. I had nothing to prove but understanding, and that, I knew, could not be quantified. I arrived at the courthouse early. Not to charm, not to intimidate, not to buy goodwill. I came simply to witness what honesty demanded. The man who had refused my money was already there, leaning against a wall, calm as ever. His posture said, I have nothing to lose, yet I have everything to gain. I have never envied anyone's calm before. Today I did. She arrived quietly, as if the world itself had paved a path for her. Her eyes met mine briefly, not angry, not hopeful, just measured. Recognition, assessment, an unspoken challenge. See yourself, and don't look away. Inside, the courtroom hummed with the low tension of anticipation. Cameras, reporters, spectators all drawn to the moment when wealth meets principle, when influence is weighed against integrity. But the real tension, as it always is, existed only between the three of us. The triangle had endured trials far beyond the courtroom walls. The judge called the session to order. The air smelled of polished wood and consequence. The four-person of the jury stood, and the verdict was read in measured, deliberate tones, full acknowledgement of my partial liability. Financial penalties significant but not crippling. Moral weight unquantifiable. I felt the words, their gravity sinking slowly, painfully. The man's expression did not change. His victory was not in numbers, but in being seen, finally, truly. And she did not rise or smile. She simply existed in that moment, a reminder that recognition is sometimes more potent than forgiveness. After the session, the three of us found ourselves alone in a quiet hallway. Not the photographers, not the lawyers, not the spectators, just the three of us, standing amidst the echoes of every choice we had ever made. You still think this ends here? He asked quietly. I thought I did, I admitted. But I see now it never was about money. No, she said softly. It's always been about truth, and honesty, and the courage to face what you've done. We walked outside together, the air crisp and sharp. The city seemed indifferent, yet somehow alive in its detachment. We didn't talk about past offers, past mistakes, past desires. The silence itself conveyed volumes. You understand why I refused? He asked. Yes, I said. Because you valued autonomy more than comfort. He nodded. Recognition again. Not admiration. Not anger. Recognition. The kind that changes a man. Quietly, without spectacle, she glanced at me then, I steady. And you? She asked. What will you do with this recognition? I will live differently, I said. Not perfectly, not always wisely, but consciously and honestly. For the first time, she smiled faintly. Not with triumph, not with hope, just with the acknowledgement of growth. We parted after that, not as enemies, not as lovers, not as friends, but as people who had survived consequence and emerged with clarity. The triangle remained, but the angles were softer, edges worn by understanding rather than control. I returned home to my penthouse and finally allowed myself to sit without pretense. No calculations, no strategies, no masks, just reflection. I opened my laptop and began to type, not for press, not for lawyers, not for public record. I wrote for myself, about choices, about influence, about love, about power. About what I had learned, what I had failed to see, and what I would strive to see from now on. Hours later, my phone buzzed. Her name appeared on the screen. Truth travels slowly, she said when I answered. But it always arrives. Yes, I said. And I am listening now. She paused. Good. Then perhaps you'll finally understand that love and honesty are not interchangeable, but they must coexist if either is to survive. I understand, I said. And for once, I truly did. I hung up and stared out at the city lights sprawling below like a map of choices and consequences. The trial was over. The courtroom had delivered judgment. The public would move on, misinterpret, misremember. But I knew, and that knowledge, fragile, profound, irreplaceable, was mine alone. For the first time in decades, I didn't calculate, I didn't negotiate, I didn't bribe. I simply existed with the consequences of my actions. Fully aware, fully accountable, and fully alive, and in that quiet reckoning, I realized the truth I had long avoided. Influence can be wielded. Love can be pursued, but honesty raw, uncomfortable. Unpurchasable honesty is the only thing that endures. The story did not end. It could not. Not for love, not for loss, not for redemption. But for the first time, I was ready to live within it, without illusion, without evasion, and without fear. The triangle remained. The city endured, and I finally understood what it meant to be human.